Hi, welcome to part 2 of Catering to the Left, where we learn how to interact with the 4 behavioral types that we see in the office that were covered in part 1. If you haven't already seen part 1, I recommend that you stop the video right now. The link to part 1 is in the description box. Please go ahead and watch part 1 before continuing on. Hi, this is Jeff Goldfinger. Welcome to the STEM Signal. This is where we help the STEM educated increase their career signal above the workplace noise. Now, let's get down to business. Okay, in part 1, we covered a lot of stuff about how to recognize the 4 behavioral parts. I'm going to do a quick review.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
So the review starts with the 4 politicians. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Catering to the Left is not about politics, but I use political figures to help you see the 4 different behavioral types. So here we have former President of India, Indira Gandhi. She is what's called a leader type. Then we have a former President of the United States as an ego type, President George Bush as a friend type, and former Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany as a thinker type. That's where I get catering to the left. Now, all 4 of these were in a leadership position, but their behavioral characteristics are defined by what we see: leaders, egoists, friends, or thinkers. Now, I gave you some examples of that by looking at The Office, the TV show, and Dunder Mifflin. We walked around the office to examine the characteristics of a leader, an egoist, a friend, and a Dwight the thinker. I also asked you to take notes on a chart. So if you have that chart from part 1, please take it out now. We went through what to notice. If you didn't watch part 1 and you don't want to, which I discourage, but you can go ahead and pause here and fill in your chart. The other thing about part 1 was I reminded you not to make any judgments. We need all 4 behavioral types to have a great interaction in the world, right? The world will be a lot different today if we didn't have the ego of Steve Jobs or Oprah Winfrey. So it's not about judging as one is better than the other. No, it's all 4 types are useful in their own way, and everybody has some features of those. All right, so then I said, okay, do you know who you are? And I had you fill out a chart that looked like this with an X and a Y axis and measuring the level from 0 to 10 of each of your characteristics. This happens to be my chart. Although I was in the Navy, I didn't wake up every day wanting to lead. I didn't want to be an admiral. I didn't want to command a ship. I'm mostly driven by my ego. I do recognize that I'm an egoist. I'm not quite very friendly. I don't have people over a lot. I don't go out to ball games and not in a bowling league or a softball league. But as you can see, I am a thinker type. I really enjoy reading deeply and picking up knowledge and facts that help me in what I do. All right, so what we're going to do today is fill in the right-hand column here on how we best to interact with each of these 4 types. So let's start with the leader type. Best way to interact with a leader is be very quick. Normally, they only give you 5 minutes, and if you can't make your case in 5 minutes, boom, you're done. At a maximum, 15 to 20 minutes. Whenever you're talking with them, focus on the enterprise value. If you have an idea, you want some funding, there's a project you're briefing, focus on how that project, that idea, that funding is going to help the enterprise as a whole. It's not about the individual, it's about the organization. Leader types take measured risks. They understand risk. In fact, of the 4 types, they are the most risk-seeking. In episode 12, in a couple weeks, you're going to see me talk about how to tell the difference between a risk seeker and a risk avoider. So for right now, just know that a leader type tends to be a risk seeker because they understand the reward that comes with taking risks. All right, the egoist focuses on enhanced identity. So again, if you're asking for money, you're briefing an idea, you're talking about a project, focus on how it enhances the egoist's identity. And if there are going to be any failures, make sure there are other people to blame. Okay, that egoists never like to take blame because they don't like anything to reflect negatively on themselves. Okay, the friend type wants opportunities to interact. So if you're briefing a project or a new idea, what elements of that project allow the friend types to interact? So weekly teleconferences, monthly meetings, annual gatherings, whatever it is, they want to be able to interact with other people. The program or idea that you have should have minimal risk. Of the 4 types, this is the most risk avoiding. In fact, 0 risk is better. The friend type really enjoys a work-life balance. As I mentioned in part 1 of this, I showed you the picture of Leonard Boxer in his office in New York, the real estate developer, had all kinds of pictures of his family. So when you walk into the office, the first thing out of your mouth is not about the project or your idea. It's, hey, how are your grandkids doing, right? So that's the notion of a friend type, is friends want to interact at a personal level. That contrasts with a leader type. The leader doesn't want to have anything to do with your I shouldn't say, look, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but normally leader types don't want to bring personal issues into the conversation. They want to stick to business. Lastly is the thinker type. The thinker type wants to see evidence. If you have an idea or a project, show me the evidence, show me the proof sources. And because thinker types recognize that risk is everywhere in the world, make sure you have a risk mitigation plan. It's not that they're either a risk seeker or a risk avoider. They just understand risk exists, so they want to see what you're doing about it. And then lastly, much like the leader type, they want to focus on the task at hand. But they think more at a task level and not a strategic level like the leader might. All right, so let's put this into action in a hypothetical scenario. I'm going to take you back about 70 years into World War II. And here we have 2 different Army generals. One is General George Patton on the left. His nickname was Blood and Guts Patton. On the right is General Omar Bradley. His nickname was the GI's General, because a World War II reporter, Ernie Pyle, noticed that he could interact with the enlisted man on the battlefield as if they were friends. So we have contrasting styles. We have the ego style and leader style of Patton, and we have the friend thinker style of Bradley. Bradley was also quite the academician. So one of the things in thinking about how you're going to interact with people, imagine, if you will, the following scenario. You're Major Winters, right, from Band of Brothers. So you're Major Winters, and you've been told to go take that enemy hill. You've got 3 days to do it. Here's your resources. You got infantry, you got tanks, you got mortars. Go take that enemy hill in 3 days. Go do your mission plan and come back and brief the general. Okay, well, if you're Major Winters, the first question ought to be, which general do I have to brief? Because that may affect the way I talk about my plan. It may not make some difference in how you actually plan it, but really, in order for it to get approved, you're definitely going to have to talk about it a certain way. So let's look at how that would work out. So on Patton, we're going to use an X to describe where Patton lies on these 4. And then Bradley, we're going to use an O. Patton, absolutely leader type. He really wanted to lead troops into battle. That was his whole modus operandi. As opposed to Bradley, yes, he was in a leadership role, but when you look into his life and what kind of billets he held in the Army, he was more an academician. He didn't want to lead, but he was thrust into that position by virtue of his leadership skills. Patton was a flaming egoist, much like me. I've toned down over the years, whereas Bradley had almost no ego. You never saw him really talking about himself, and when I say saw, in his writings and in depictions of him, pop culture. Okay, friend type, Patton, not so much. Bradley, much higher. Largely, there's some discussion about whether he was a true high-order friend, like his nickname implies. There's some discussion and controversy of that. But compared to Patton, he certainly was a much more personable individual. And then lastly, thinker type. Yes, Patton did research, but mostly just wartime battles that he wanted to understand from his role as a combat leader. Whereas Bradley really got into academia. He had multiple tours, multiple instructor/professor tours while in the Army, In fact, one of his final tour right before going into combat was the commanding general of the Army Infantry School. So he really was a thinker type. All right, so if you're going to brief, if you're Major Winters briefing Patton versus Bradley, for Patton, you're going to talk about how quickly you're going to attack and take over the enemy stronghold and how many enemy you're going to kill. Whereas Bradley, your focus is going to be on minimum risk, how you're going to do what you can to prevent any friendly losses. Okay. Again, the objective is the same. Your resources are the same, but the way you design your mission and talk about your mission to the listener is going to be completely different. That's what you're going to get. The approval is based on talking to their listening. And this is where we in the STEM educated fields tend to overlook. We tend to talk the way we think, where we talk as a thinker type, and it's all about the proof sources and the evidence, and we make very long briefs. You have to understand that it's about the listener that should take precedence. Our briefings should be designed for the listener, not for what we want to say. Now, based on that, you need to be prepared to adjust. So here's the case of a situation I was in many years ago. I owned an upscale nightclub and cigar bar in San Diego. And one of my partners in the club had a completely different profile than I did. So leaders, we were both kind of down there. Egoists, oh my God, big match. Friend type, not so much. Thinker type, big gap. So some things to notice is leaders like to be around other leaders. Friends like to be around anybody. Thinker types don't really care. It's not about people. It's about the task and the science. Ego types hate other ego types to be around. So how did we get along? Well, we realized that the only way to get along, since we both had strong egos, is we used to play this little game. We tried to out-compliment each other whenever we were at the bar in front of customers. It was a little game we played to be able to get along. Contrast that with a story I'm going to tell you more details about in our next episode. But I was working at a large defense contractor, and my boss's boss had a large ego, and so did I. And this was maybe 15, almost 20 years ago. And so I didn't have the sensibility that I do today about this. And so he and I, there was a lot of friction in the room. So my mentor and I quickly realized that after the very first time I briefed him, I shouldn't do that too much more, right? So I would prepare all the materials, but my mentor would do the briefing, or we'd get somebody else. So I had to adjust in order to do that. All right, so here's a more concrete example. This is Dr. Robert Cialdini. He's a professor of psychology, and his research talks about influence and the psychology of persuasion. This is his seminal piece of work, and there's a really cool paragraph in there that I'd like to read to you. So when Cialdini was going around to different industries, he was curious about the restaurant industry and what made a influential waiter, right? A waiter who can help drive sales for the restaurant and also drive up his or her tips. He tried to get a job as a waiter there, but they wouldn't let him because he didn't have any skills. The guy's a PhD in psychology. So instead, they hired him as a busboy. And so he started working and noticing, it turns out it was better for him because he noticed that there was this one waiter called Vince that was the most influential waiter among the bunch. So here in his own words, he describes that interaction. So I began to linger in my duties around Vincent's tables to observe his style. I quickly learned that his style was to have no single style. He had a repertoire of them, each ready to be called on under the appropriate circumstances. When the customers were a family, he was effervescent, even slightly clownish, directing his remarks as often to the children as to the adults. With a younger couple on a date, he became formal and a bit imperious in an attempt to intimidate the young man into ordering and tipping lavishly. With an older married couple, he retained the formality but dropped the superior air in favor of a respectful orientation to both members of the couple. Should the patron be dining alone, Vincent selected a friendly demeanor, cordial, conversational, and warm. Now, some of you might think that story about Vince is a little bit disingenuous, that Vince is really a chameleon. There's nothing authentic about him. That is one way to think about it, that his motives driven by tips were tended to suppress his individual identity. I happen to have a different view. This is my own view. This is not Dr. Cialdini's view. My view is he was being as genuine as he could be, in the sense that he put his own behavioral preference aside for the sake of the enjoyment of his customer. And again, I use the word customer. In this case, it's pretty obvious. But in your workplace, customer has the most broadest definition. Customers can be subordinates, superiors, peers, external customers, internal customers. So in the broadest sense, when you understand the listening, the behavioral type of your customer, you can cater to their needs. And that's why I call this catering to the left. Okay, that concludes this lesson. If you found the content valuable, please like and subscribe, of course. But to really increase your STEM signal, you want to let others know about this channel. Send them a link, talk to them about this at a lunch break. Increase your STEM signal by telling others about the value you found in this presentation. All right, thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you again next week when we visit episode 11 on how to raid the room.